The barn stands at the bend of a gravel road in eastern Iowa. Its red paint faded to the color of old brick. Its roof patched in 3 different shades of tin. Above the haymow, behind a small square door cut into the gable, there is a loft. Not a loft for hay, not a loft for tools. A loft for iron. Stacked in rows along oak joists, separated by slats and shimmied with cedar wedges, sit cracked cylinder heads. Some are coated in light dust. Some are wrapped in burlap. Some still wear the grease of the engines they came from. 18 years of accumulation. 18 years of neighbors driving up the lane with broken castings in the bed of a pickup. And the farmer accepting each one without a sermon and without a receipt. His name is on the mailbox in faded white paint. He is a quiet man. He has never explained the loft to anyone, and he has never apologized for it. Then one autumn night, the regional foundry burns to the ground, and every pattern inside it turns to ash. And the question the loft has been asking for 18 years finally gets answered. What does broken actually mean? The first head arrives on a Tuesday in October of 1979, riding in the bed of a 1968 Chevy C10 with a dented tailgate and a left tail light held in place by electrical tape. The truck belongs to Harlan Bauer, a neighbor from 2 miles east, a man with a face the color of a saddle and hands that have been broken and reset more times than he can count. Harlan farms 320 acres of corn and beans on bottom ground. He is 58 years old. He smokes Pall Malls without filters, and he is, by his own admission, finished with the Oliver 88 that has been sitting behind his machine shed since June. The Oliver 88 is a 1952 model. Row crop, gasoline, 6 cylinders, 194 cubic inches. Originally rated at 38 horsepower at the drawbar. It was the tractor Harlan bought used in 1961 for $1,400. And it was the tractor that pulled his 2-row cultivator through 18 seasons of corn. In June of that year, on a humid afternoon with the air thick enough to cut, the engine seized while Harlan was disking a bean field. He coasted it to a stop, shut off the fuel, and walked the half-mile back to the house. He has not started it since. Now, 4 months later, Harlan stands beside the C10, with his hands in the pockets of a denim jacket worn through at both elbows. In the truck bed, wrapped loosely in an old grain tarp, sits the cylinder head from the Oliver 88. The head is heavy, cast iron. 41 pounds of foundry work poured at the Oliver factory in Charles City, Iowa, more than a quarter century earlier. Across the deck surface, running from the number 2 exhaust port to the number 3 intake, there is a hairline crack. It is not dramatic. It is not the kind of crack that announces itself. It is a thin, dark line, barely the width of a pencil mark. But it is a line that has cost Harlan Bauer his tractor. The farmer comes out of the barn, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. He is a few years older than Harlan, lean, narrow at the shoulders, with eyes the color of weak tea. His name is Elias. He nods once at Harlan, nods once at the truck, and walks around to the tailgate without saying anything. Harlan speaks first. He says the dealer in Cedar Rapids took one look at the head and shook his head. He says the dealer said there is no core. He says the dealer said no core, no rebuild, no point. He says the dealer offered him 60 cents a pound for scrap iron, which works out to about $24.60 for a head that cost the Oliver factory more than that to cast in 1952. Harlan says he told the dealer to keep his 60 cents. He says he would rather drop it in the creek than give it to a man who calls a cylinder head scrap iron. Elias listens. He runs his thumb along the crack on the deck surface. He turns the head over and looks at the combustion chambers. He checks the casting number on the underside, a long string of digits stamped into the iron, and he reads it the way another man might read scripture. Then he straightens up and asks Harlan if he can have it. Harlan laughs. It is a short, dry laugh, the kind of laugh that does not contain any humor. He says Elias can have it for the price of a cup of coffee. He says Elias can have it for nothing. He says he is glad to be rid of it because every time he walks past it sitting in the bed of the C-10, he thinks about the 18 seasons it gave him, and he gets a feeling in his chest that he does not want to have. So Elias can have it. Take it. Bury it. Throw it off the river bridge. He does not care. Elias does not bury it. Elias does not throw it off the river bridge. Elias asks Harlan to back the C-10 up to the side of the barn, under the small square door cut into the gable above the haymow. Then he walks into the barn, climbs a ladder of weathered 2x4s nailed to the inside wall, and opens the loft door from the inside. He lowers a length of half-inch hemp rope down to the truck bed. He tells Harlan to make a cradle of the tarp and tie it tight. Harlan does what Elias asks. He has known Elias for 30 years. He does not understand what Elias is doing, but he has learned that asking Elias to explain himself is like asking a fence post to recite the alphabet. So he ties the tarp into a cradle around the cracked Oliver 88 head, knots the rope through the four corners, and steps back. Elias hauls the head up the side of the barn alone. 41 pounds of cast iron rising slow and steady against the faded red boards, swinging slightly in the October wind, the rope creaking through the loft door. When the head reaches the opening, Elias swings it inside, sets it on the planks, and unties the cradle. The tarp falls away. The Oliver 88 head sits on the loft floor in the slanted afternoon light coming through the gable. And for the first time since June, it is not in motion, not in transit, not on its way to a scrapyard. It is somewhere it can stay. Elias sets the head along the north wall of the loft, on a piece of 1x6 oak laid across 2 cedar shims. He turns it so the casting number faces up. He takes a stub of carpenter's pencil from his shirt pocket and writes the date on the joist above it. October 14th, 1979. Then he writes the make, Oliver 88. Then he writes the source, Bauer. Then he climbs back down the ladder. Harlan is still standing by the C-10. He asks Elias what he's going to do with it. Elias looks at him for a long moment. He says he is going to keep it. Harlan asks him why. Elias does not answer. Harlan waits. The October wind moves through the windbreak of Norway spruce along the lane. A meadowlark calls from the fence line. Somewhere over the next quarter section a tractor is running, the steady chug of a 2-cylinder John Deere working through the last cuttings of alfalfa. Elias never answers the question. He shakes Harlan's hand, thanks him for the head, and walks back into the barn. Harlan stands by his truck for another minute, then climbs in, starts the C-10, and drives back down the lane toward the gravel road. The dust hangs in the air behind him for a long time. That night, after the chores are done and the kitchen lamp is lit, Elias sits at the table with a notebook open in front of him. The notebook is bound in black cloth, the kind sold at the co-op for 98 cents. On the first page, in careful pencil, he writes a heading, Cylinder Heads. Beneath it, he writes the first entry, October 14th, 1979. Oliver 88, 1952. Casting, deck crack between number 2 exhaust and number 3 intake. Source, Harlan Bauer. Condition, sound iron. No missing material. He closes the notebook. He sets it on the shelf, beside the kerosene lamp. In the loft, the Oliver 88 head sits in the dark, alone on its oak board. Cast iron does not speak. Cast iron does not explain itself. It only waits. And whatever Elias is keeping it for, whatever he is waiting for, the iron is patient enough to wait with him. The first act of keeping has been performed. The loft is no longer empty. And somewhere down the road, in the back of another machine shed, in the bed of another truck, the second head is already cracking. The summer of 1975 had been, by every account that mattered around the county, a summer that took the bottom out of things. Corn closed at $2.54 a bushel at the Cedar Rapids elevator, on the last day of harvest. Diesel fuel had jumped to 55 cents a gallon. The farm credit office in town had stopped answering its phone after 4 in the afternoon. Nobody anywhere on any of the gravel roads that fanned out from Elias's place was spending money on engine repairs. They were spending money on seed corn and banknotes and not much else. Which is why, in the spring of 1976, 3 Farmall M cylinder heads arrived at Elias's barn in a single season. Not at the same time. Not from the same farm. But within 4 months of each other, between March and July, 3 different neighbors drove up the lane with a Farmall M head in the bed of a pickup and the same tired expression on their faces. The Farmall M was the workhorse tractor of the Midwest from 1939 through 1952. International Harvester built nearly 300,000 of them. 4 cylinders, 248 cubic inches, gasoline distillate, or all fuel depending on the order sheet. Rated at around 36 horsepower at the drawbar in its original tune. By 1976, the youngest of them was 24 years old, and the oldest was 37. Every M still in the field had been overhauled at least once, most of them twice. The cylinder heads on those tractors had absorbed 3 decades of expansion and contraction, of cold starts on January mornings and overheated afternoons in August baling hay. And the iron had remembered every cycle. When the heads cracked, they cracked in the same places, between the valve seats, across the water jacket, through the deck, around the head bolts. The first M head of the 1976 season arrives in March, brought by a man named Walter Schroeder. Walter farms 160 acres 4 miles south. He is a heavy-set man with a beard the color of iron filings and a way of standing that suggests he is always about to lift something. The head in the bed of his Ford F-100 came off a 1948 Farmall M that has been the only tractor on the Schroeder place since Walter's father bought it new at the IH dealership in Anamosa. Walter's father is dead. The tractor is not. Or it was not, until the head cracked in February during a cold snap that bottomed out at 22 below. Walter does not waste words. He says the dealer told him a new head, factory replacement, would run him $320, plus gaskets, plus labor, plus a valve job, because if you are putting a head on, you might as well do the valves. He says by the time the dealer was done adding things up, the bill was going to be $630. He says corn is $2.54, and his banker is not in the mood to talk about another note. So the M is sitting under a tarp behind the corn crib, and the head is in the bed of the F-100. And what does Elias want for taking it? Elias takes it for nothing. He climbs the ladder, opens the loft door, lowers the rope. Walter ties the cradle. The head rises up the side of the barn the same way the Oliver 88 head rose 6 months earlier, slow and steady against the faded red boards, the rope creaking, the iron swinging slightly in the spring wind. When the head reaches the loft, Elias sets it along the east wall on a fresh oak board laid across cedar shims. He turns it so the crack faces up. He takes the carpenter's pencil from his shirt pocket. On the joist above it, he writes, March 19, 1976, Farmall M. Schroeder. Then he kneels down with the pencil and a small steel rule, and he maps the crack. This is something he has begun doing. On a strip of paper torn from the back of a feed receipt, he draws the outline of the head in pencil. He marks the crack. He notes its length, 3 3/8 inches. He notes its depth, surface only, no penetration to the water jacket. He notes the casting date, stamped into the iron, just below the thermostat housing, F9M, which is the foundry code for September of 1949. He folds the paper, writes Schroeder on the outside, and tucks it into a cigar box that sits on a shelf above the loft door. The second M head arrives in May. The man who brings it is named Roy Tesmer. Roy is a tall, thin man, 63 years old with hands that shake slightly from a tremor he has had since the war. Roy farms 200 acres on rolling ground east of the river. His Farmall M is a 1951 model with the live PTO option, one of the last good years before IH switched over to the Super M. The head cracked in April when Roy tried to start it on a morning that was warmer than the engine block, and the thermal shock did the rest. Roy stands in the lane with his hands in his pockets and tells Elias that the dealer in Cedar Rapids called the head a boat anchor. That was the dealer's word. Boat anchor. Not engine part. Not casting. Boat anchor. As if the only thing left for it was to be tied to a length of chain and dropped over the side of a John boat to hold it in place while a man fished for catfish. Roy says the dealer offered him $14 for it as scrap. Roy says he told the dealer to keep his $14. Roy says he heard from Walter Schroeder that Elias was taking heads. Is that true? Elias says it is true. He climbs the ladder. He lowers the rope. The head rises. He sets it on the east wall, 2 feet south of the Schroeder head, separated by a fresh oak slat to keep the iron from touching the iron. He maps the crack. He notes the casting date, F3M, March of 1951. He folds the paper, writes Tesmer on the outside, and tucks it into the cigar box. On the joist, he writes, May 7th, 1976. Farmall M. Tesmer. The third M head arrives in July. The man who brings it is younger, in his early 30s, a son rather than a father. His name is Dale Kuhn, and he has just inherited his uncle's farm. 80 acres of timber and pasture and 1 cracked Farmall M sitting in a pole barn with the hood off and the head bolts already loosened. Dale does not know what to do with any of it. He has a job at the John Deere plant in Waterloo, and he has no intention of farming the 80 acres. He plans to sell the land and the equipment and put the money toward a house. The Farmall M is a problem because nobody wants it. 2 implement dealers have already passed. The salvage yard offered him $60 for the whole tractor. Dale heard from Roy Tesmer that Elias was taking cracked heads. So here he is. Elias takes the head. He does not pay Dale anything because Dale does not ask for anything. Dale just wants it gone. The head goes up the side of the barn on the rope, swings into the loft, settles onto its oak board along the east wall. 3 Farmall M heads now, lined up in a row, separated by oak slats, the casting numbers facing up. On the joist, Elias writes, July 22nd, 1976. Farmall M. Kuhn. That night he opens the black notebook at the kitchen table. Under the entries from 1976, he writes a note to himself. 3 M heads this season. All deck cracks. All between the valve seats. None penetrate the water jacket. Iron is sound. He underlines sound. Then he closes the notebook. In town at the implement dealer, the parts man tells a customer that he has seen 6 cracked Farmall M heads come through the door this year. 6. He says he has told every one of those farmers the same thing. Boat anchor, not engine part. He says cast iron does not heal. He says the only thing to do with a cracked head is melt it down and pour it into something else. He laughs while he says this. The easy laugh of a man who has been right about things for a long time and expects to keep being right. Out at Elias's place, the loft holds 4 heads. The Oliver 88 along the north wall, the 3 Farmall M's along the east wall. The oak boards beneath them are level. The cedar shims are tight. The cigar box on the shelf above the loft door holds 4 folded papers, 4 crack maps drawn in pencil on the backs of feed receipts. The casting dates span from September of 1949 to March of 1951 to September of 1952. 3 different foundries, 3 different pours, 1 pattern of failure, repeating across the iron like a melody played in 3 different keys. Elias has not told anyone what he is doing. He has not told Harlan Bauer. He has not told Walter Schroeder or Roy Tesmer or Dale Kuhn. He has not told the parts man in town, who would laugh at him the same way he laughs at his customers. He has not told his wife, who died in 1971 and is buried in the Lutheran cemetery on the hill above the river. He has not told himself in any way that he could put into words. He only knows that the iron is sound. He only knows that a casting number is a kind of name, and a casting date is a kind of birthday, and a crack is a kind of wound, and wounds, in iron as in flesh, are not always the end of the story. He only knows that the dealers are wrong, and the parts men are wrong, and the salvage yards are wrong, and he cannot prove they are wrong. Not yet. Not with anything he can hold up in front of them and say, look. So he keeps stacking. He keeps mapping. He keeps writing dates on the joists of the loft above the barn. And down the gravel road on a farm where two old John Deere Model A tractors are sitting in a fence row with weeds growing through the steering wheels, an old man is dying, and his son is already thinking about what to do with the loft full of iron the old man left behind. The call comes in November of 1978. A man named Carl Brunner, who farms half a section 10 miles north, telephones Elias on a Sunday afternoon and asks if Elias is the man who has been taking the cracked cylinder heads. Carl says he heard it from Roy Tesmer, who heard it from Walter Schroeder, who heard it from Harlan Bauer. The information has traveled the length of 3 gravel roads and crossed a county line. Carl says his father died in September. Carl says his father left behind, among other things, 2 John Deere Model A tractors, both with cracked heads, both sitting in a fence row on the home place where they have been sitting since 1969. Carl says his mother wants the fence row cleaned up. Carl says he wants the heads gone before the snow flies. Will Elias come look at them? Elias drives the 10 miles north on a Sunday afternoon in his 1965 Ford F-250. The truck is the color of dried mud, with a wooden stake bed and a winch mounted behind the cab. The November sky is the color of galvanized tin. Along the gravel roads, the corn stubble runs in straight rows down to the horizon, and the windbreaks of Norway spruce stand black against the gray sky. Elias drives with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the bench seat beside him. He does not turn on the radio. He never turns on the radio. The Brunner place sits at the end of a long lane lined with bur oak trees that have been there since before the Civil War. The house is a white 2-story with a porch that wraps around 3 sides. The barn is gambrel roofed, painted red with white trim, and clearly maintained by a man who is now dead. Carl Brunner meets Elias in the dooryard. Carl is 41 years old, a tall, thin man with a mustache the color of straw, dressed in a quilted work coat that is too clean for the work he is asking Elias to do. Carl is not a farmer. Carl sells insurance in Cedar Rapids. The home place is a problem he has inherited and would like to be rid of. Carl walks Elias along the south fence line to the spot where the 2 John Deere Model A tractors are sitting. The fence row is overgrown with multiflora rose and wild grape. The tractors have been swallowed by the brush to the point that only their rear tires and the upper edges of their hoods are visible. Carl says his father parked them in the fence row in 1969 after the second one cracked. Carl says his father always meant to fix them. Carl says his father said every spring for 9 years that he was going to get to them this season. Carl says his father did not get to them. Elias works through the multiflora rows with a pair of gloved hands and a corn knife. It takes him 40 minutes to clear the brush off the first tractor. When the iron emerges from the wild grape and the dead canes of rose, Elias stops and stands and looks. The tractor is a John Deere Model A. 2 cylinders, 321 cubic inches, horizontal. The unmistakable shape of the long hood and the flywheel on the left side. The serial number plate, when Elias wipes it clean, places the casting in 1934. One of the early A models. Spoke flywheel, hand clutch. The head is cracked across the top, between the 2 cylinders. a hairline that runs from the front edge of the casting to the rear, almost exactly along the center line. Elias has seen this crack before. It is a thermal crack, the kind that forms when an engine is shut down hot and a cold rain hits the head before the iron has a chance to cool evenly. It is, in his experience, a crack that does not penetrate. The iron above the water jacket is thick. The crack is on the surface. The casting is sound. The second Model A is 20 feet farther down the fence row, and its head wears the same crack, in the same place, with the same character. The second tractor is a 1934 casting as well, a pair. Bought new, most likely, by Carl Brunner's father in the same year, on the same dealer's lot, in the same transaction. They have spent 44 years on the same farm doing the same work until they cracked in succession and were retired to the same fence row. Now they are about to be separated for the first time since they left the John Deere factory in Waterloo. Elias straightens up. He tells Carl he will take both heads. Carl asks how much Elias will pay. Elias says $7 each. Carl laughs, a short laugh, the laugh of a man who has just been told he is being given charity. Carl says $7 each is not enough to pay him for his time loading them. Carl says $7 each is barely enough for a tank of gas. Carl says the scrapyard offered him $18 for both heads as iron. And Carl is asking why he should take 14 from Elias when he can get 18 from the scrapyard. Elias does not argue. Elias says Carl should take the $18 from the scrapyard. Elias says he will not pay more than $7 each because $7 each is what the heads are worth to him in his current position, and he will not pretend otherwise. Elias says he is not in the business of buying iron above its value, and he is not in the business of selling iron below its value, and what Carl does with the heads is Carl's business. Carl stands in the fence row for a long moment. The November wind moves through the bur oaks along the lane. A red-tailed hawk circles above the cornfield to the west. Carl looks at the two cracked heads, sitting in the brush behind the half-buried tractors, and he thinks about driving them to the scrapyard, lifting them into the truck himself, unloading them on the scale, waiting for the man at the office to write him a check for $18. He thinks about the hour and a half it will take. He thinks about the gas. He thinks about the fact that his mother is in the house waiting for him to come back and tell her the fence row is being cleaned out. Carl takes the $14. He calls it charity, but he takes it. Elias counts out 2 $5 bills and 4 $1 bills from a leather wallet that has been in his back pocket for 30 years. He hands them to Carl. Then he and Carl spend an hour pulling the heads off the two Model A tractors with a set of wrenches Elias keeps in a wooden box behind the cab of the F-250. The head bolts come out hard. The gaskets are fused to the iron from 9 years in the weather. But the heads come free. Elias loads them into the stake bed of the F-250, one at a time, on a folded tarp. He drives the 10 miles back south with the two Model A heads in the bed of the truck. The sun is setting behind the windbreaks. The corn stubble glows orange for 10 minutes and then goes gray. When he reaches his own lane, he backs the F-250 up to the side of the barn, climbs the ladder, opens the loft door, and lowers the rope. He hauls the first Model A head up the side of the barn alone. 210 pounds of cast iron rising slow and steady against the faded red boards. The rope creaks through the loft door. The November wind pushes against the iron and makes it swing. He sets the first Model A head along the south wall on a fresh oak board laid across cedar shims. He hauls up the second head and sets it next to the first, separated by an oak slat. The two heads sit side by side, the casting numbers facing up, the centerline cracks running parallel like a pair of train tracks. On the joist above them he writes, November 12, 1978. John Deere, Model A pair, Brunner. He stands in the loft for a moment in the fading light. The Oliver 88 head is along the north wall. The three Farmall M's are along the east wall. The two Model A's are along the south wall. 6 heads. He counts them again. 6. He has been keeping them for 19 months. He has paid a total of $14 in cash and nothing else. He climbs down the ladder. In the kitchen, by the light of the kerosene lamp, he opens the black notebook. He writes the entry for the Brunner heads. Casting date 1934. Centerline thermal cracks, both heads. Surface only. No water jacket penetration. Source: Carl Brunner. Original owner deceased. Paid $7 each. He closes the notebook. But before he sets it on the shelf, he turns to the inside back cover. On the inside back cover, in the same careful pencil, he keeps a tally. He has been keeping the tally since the second head, the Schroeder Farmall M. He erases the previous number and writes the new one. 6. The tally will reach 11 before another full year has passed. By the autumn of 1978, 4 more heads will arrive. A second Oliver, this one a Super 88. A pair of International H heads from a farmer named Clemens whose father retired the tractors in 1965. And a Massey Harris 44 head brought by a man Elias has never met before, who heard about the Loft from a cousin in another county. The information has spread. The Loft has a reputation. Without ever having advertised, without ever having asked, without ever having explained himself, Elias has become the man who takes the cracked heads. In the Loft, the iron accumulates. Along the north wall, the Oliver 88, alone. Along the east wall, the 3 Farmall M's in a row. Along the south wall, the 2 John Deere Model A's, side by side. And after October of 1978, along the west wall, the second Oliver and the pair of International H's and the Massey Harris 44. 11 heads. The Loft has space for many more. The joists are oak, 12 inches deep, set on 24-inch centers, more than capable of holding the weight. The cedar shims are tight. The oak boards are level. The cigar box on the shelf above the loft door is full of folded papers. On the joist above the loft door, in a separate column, Elias has begun keeping a different list. A list of casting numbers, a list of foundry codes, a list of cracks and their locations. He does not know yet what he is going to do with the list. He does not know yet what he is going to do with any of the iron. He only knows that it is sound, and that the dealers are wrong, and that somewhere, eventually, the time will come when the question of what to do will answer itself. Down the gravel road, on a farm 3 miles east, an Alice Chalmers WD-45 is sitting under a tarp behind a machine shed, its head already cracked, its owner already telling the story to a mechanic who is already telling him to scrap it. The feed sack is already in the bed of the pickup. The drive to Elias's lane has not happened yet, but it is coming. The summer of 1981 broke heat records across eastern Iowa that had stood since the Dust Bowl. In July, the temperature in Cedar Rapids reached 104 degrees on 3 consecutive afternoons. The corn rolled its leaves into tight green tubes by 10 in the morning and did not unroll them until well after sunset. The bean fields turned a tired olive color. The ditches dried out, and every cooling system on every aging tractor in the county was tested past the limit of what its gaskets and its iron could bear. The Alice Chalmers WD-45 head arrives in the second week of August. It comes wrapped in a feed sack, a burlap bag with the faded stenciling of the Quaker Oats milling division still legible across the side. The man who brings it is a farmer named Otto Jensen, 51 years old, square-shouldered, with a sunburn across the back of his neck the color of brick dust. Otto farms 190 acres on the ridge above the creek, 3 miles east of Elias's place. He raises hogs and corn. He has been driving an Alice Chalmers WD-45 since 1959, when he bought it used for $900 from an estate sale in Mount Vernon. The WD-45 is the tractor that put Alice Chalmers on the map for a brief stretch in the early 1950s. 4 cylinders, 226 cubic inches, gasoline or LP gas, with the optional power director hand clutch that let an operator shift between high and low range without stopping. Rated at 33 horsepower at the drawbar in its original tune, Otto's WD-45 is a 1955 model, persimmon orange faded to the color of an old terracotta pot, with a homemade canopy bolted to the operator's platform and a pair of wheel weights on the rear cast iron centers. The head cracked in late July. Otto was running the WD-45 on a 4-row cultivator in the bean field when the temperature gauge climbed past 200 and held there. He shut the tractor down and raised the hood. The radiator was full, but the upper hose was hot enough to burn his hand through a leather glove. He let the tractor cool for an hour. He restarted it. Within 10 minutes, the gauge was back at 200. He drove it home in low gear at quarter throttle and parked it behind the machine shed. When he pulled the head a week later, after the iron had finally cooled, the crack was already visible without removing the head bolts. It ran from the number 3 valve seat down through the deck and into the water jacket. A textbook failure. The kind of crack that every parts man in every dealership across the Midwest had a name for and a recommendation about. Otto took the head to the Alice Chalmers dealer in Mount Vernon first. The dealer told him a replacement head, used, rebuilt, would run him $240 if one could be found, and they were getting harder to find every year. The dealer suggested checking the salvage yards. Otto checked 3 salvage yards. The closest WD-45 head any of them had was in Wisconsin, and the asking price was $310 plus shipping. Otto did not have $310 plus shipping. The interest rate on his operating note that spring had been 12.5%, the highest it had been in his lifetime, and every dollar he had was already committed to seed and fertilizer and diesel fuel. So Otto took the head to the mechanic at the Farmers Cooperative in town. The mechanic was a man named Junior Hollister, 40 years old, who had been working on tractor engines since he was 14. Junior took one look at the head, set it on his workbench under a fluorescent light, and ran his finger along the crack from the valve seat to the water jacket. Junior said it was a textbook failure. Junior said the crack had penetrated the water jacket, which meant the head was no longer holding compression and was no longer holding coolant. Junior said in his professional opinion the head was not worth pinning, not worth stitching, not worth any of the various salvage techniques that traveling repairmen sometimes claimed could fix a casting. Junior said scrap it. Junior said cut your losses. Junior said put the money toward a different head. Otto did not have money to put toward a different head. Otto put the head back into the bed of his pickup, drove it home, and set it on a shelf in the machine shed. It sat on the shelf for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Otto's WD-45 sat behind the machine shed with the hood off and a tarp over the open block to keep the rain out. During those 3 weeks, Otto's neighbor mentioned to him over coffee at the cooperative that there was a farmer 2 miles west who had been taking cracked heads for a few years now. The neighbor's name for it was the Loft. The neighbor said the man at the Loft was named Elias, and that he did not pay much, sometimes not anything, but that he took the heads and that nobody quite knew what he did with them. Otto thought about it for a few days. Then on a Saturday morning in the second week of August, he wrapped the WD-45 head in the Quaker Oats feed sack, loaded it into the bed of his Chevrolet pickup, and drove the 3 miles west to Elias's lane. The morning is already hot when Otto pulls into the dooryard. The thermometer on the side of the barn reads 88 degrees, and it is not yet 10 in the morning. The cicadas are loud in the elm trees along the lane. Elias is in the dooryard with a bucket and a wire brush, cleaning the cooling fins on a Wisconsin air-cooled engine that powers his grain auger. He straightens up when he sees Otto's truck. He sets the wire brush on the upturned bucket. He walks over. Otto introduces himself. They have met once or twice at farm sales, but they do not know each other well. Otto says he is here about a head. Otto says he heard from a man at the cooperative that Elias takes them. Otto says he has a WD-45 head wrapped in a feed sack in the bed of the pickup. And the mechanic at the cooperative has told him to scrap it. And the dealer in Mount Vernon has told him a replacement is $240 he does not have. And what would Elias say? Elias walks around to the bed of the pickup. He pulls back the burlap of the Quaker Oats feed sack. He looks at the head. He sees the crack from the number 3 valve seat through the deck and into the water jacket. He runs his thumb along it the way he ran his thumb along the Oliver 88 crack 2 years earlier. He turns the head over. He looks at the casting number stamped into the iron just behind the thermostat housing. The casting number is a 6-digit string followed by a foundry code. Elias reads the casting number, and his expression does not change in any way that Otto can detect. But something in the set of his shoulders shifts. The casting number is the original Alice Chalmers WD-40 5-cylinder head number, the production casting from the West Alice Foundry in Wisconsin. The pattern that was retired when Alice Chalmers consolidated its tractor production in the late 1950s and stopped pouring replacement heads at West Alice. The casting number tells Elias that the head Otto has brought him is one of the original 1955 production castings. The iron poured at the factory in the year the tractor was built. Not a service replacement, not a rebuild. The original head. Elias does not explain any of this to Otto. Elias says he will take the head. Elias asks Otto to back the pickup up to the side of the barn. Otto backs the pickup up. Elias climbs the ladder of weathered 2x4s nailed to the inside wall. He opens the loft door. He lowers the half-inch hemp rope. Otto, in the bed of the pickup, makes a cradle of the Quaker Oats feed sack around the head and ties the 4 corners through the rope. Then he steps back. The WD-45 head rises slow and steady against the faded red boards of the barn. 52 pounds of cast iron swinging slightly in the August heat, the rope creaking through the loft door. When the head reaches the opening, Elias swings it inside, sets it on the planks, and unties the cradle. The Quaker Oats feed sack falls away. The WD-45 head sits on the loft floor in the slanted morning light. Elias does not stack it with the other heads right away. He carries it to a separate shelf along the west wall, a shelf he has built since the previous summer, a shelf made of 2 oak boards laid across iron brackets bolted into the studs. On this shelf there are already 2 heads, set apart from the others, not stacked along the walls in the rows that have been growing for 2 years. One is a Minneapolis Moline UB head. The other is an International Harvester Super C head. Both have casting numbers that Elias has identified as original production iron from foundries that no longer pour replacement heads. He sets the Alice Chalmers WD-45 head on the shelf, next to the Minneapolis Moline. He turns it so the casting number faces up. He takes the carpenter's pencil from his shirt pocket. On the joist above the shelf, he writes, August 9th, 1981, Alice Chalmers WD-45. Jensen, original West Alice casting. Then he climbs back down the ladder. In the dooryard, Otto is waiting. Otto asks Elias what he owes him. Elias says nothing. Elias says he does not owe anything. Elias says the head is taken care of. Otto stands in the dooryard for a moment and tries to think of something else to say, but nothing comes. He shakes Elias's hand, climbs back into his pickup, and drives the 3 miles east to his own farm. The Quaker Oats feed sack is left behind in the bed of the truck. Otto does not notice it until 2 days later. That night, by the kerosene lamp at the kitchen table, Elias opens the black notebook. He writes the entry for the Jensen WD-45 head. Casting date stamped beneath the thermostat housing places the pour at March of 1955. Crack from number 3, valve seat through deck into water jacket. Source: Otto Jensen. Original West Allis production iron. Set apart on shelf with Minneapolis Moline UB and International Super C. Then he turns to a different page in the notebook. A page he has been writing on for the past year, a page with a heading at the top in careful pencil. The heading reads, Original Castings. Below it there is a list. The list has 9 entries. He adds the Jensen WD-45 as the 10th. Beside each entry, there is a casting number, a foundry code, a date, and a note about the location of the crack. Beside each entry, there is also a small mark that Elias has been making for a year now, without telling anyone what it means. The mark is a single dot in pencil. The dot indicates that the casting, in Elias's judgment, is recoverable. He closes the notebook. He sets it on the shelf beside the kerosene lamp. He blows out the lamp. The kitchen goes dark. In the loft, the Alice Chalmers WD-45 head sits on the shelf along the west wall, between the Minneapolis Moline UB and the International Super C. Below the shelf, in the rows along the north wall and the east wall and the south wall, 23 other heads sit on their oak boards in the dark. The interest rate is 12.5%. Corn is $2.97. Nobody is fixing anything. The dealers are saying scrap. The mechanics are saying scrap. The salvage yards are saying scrap. And in the loft above the barn, in the dark, the iron waits. The Minneapolis Moline UB head, sitting next to the Alice Chalmers WD-45, has its own story. And it is a story that Elias has not yet finished writing in the black notebook, because the second UB head has not yet arrived. When it does, the question of what is being kept and why will begin to come into focus. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, the loft holds 24 heads, and the foundry on the edge of town is still standing, and the patterns inside it are still safe, and the answer to what broken means is still 7 years away. The truck that carried the 4 Minneapolis Moline UB heads into Harlan Bauer's yard arrived in the second week of October 1983, and the morning was the kind of cold that makes a man's breath show before the sun does. Harlan stood on the porch of the white farmhouse in his canvas chore coat, the one with the torn pocket he never bothered to mend, and watched the dealer's flatbed roll up the gravel drive with 4 shapes under a tarp that had once been green and was now the color of wet straw. The dealer was a man named Royce Tilton, 54 years old, lean as a fence post, and he wore a feed store cap pushed back on his head the way men do when they are about to say something they think is funny. Royce pulled the tarp back, and there they were. 4 cylinder heads, all from Minneapolis Moline UB tractors, all cracked, all stacked on the bed of the truck, like loaves of something nobody wanted to bake. The prairie gold paint that had once made the UB famous was barely visible on any of them. One head had a fracture that ran clean across the deck, from the number 1 combustion chamber to the number 4, a long, jagged line that looked drawn by a child with a crayon. Another had a corner broken away entirely, exposing a water jacket that was furred with rust the color of dried blood. The third had been welded once, badly, by someone who did not understand what cast iron does when you put a torch to it. The fourth looked at first glance almost whole. Only when you ran your hand along the underside did you find the hairline that traveled the length of the manifold face like a thread pulled through cloth. Royce Tilton laughed when Harlan offered him $40 for the lot. He laughed the way a man laughs when he thinks he has put one over on his neighbor, when he believes he has just sold 4 pieces of scrap iron to a fool for the price of a Sunday dinner. $40. 10 apiece. Royce shook his head and counted the bills out loud, as if the saying of the numbers made the deal more real, more permanent, more impossible to take back. He told Harlan he was throwing his money in the creek. He told Harlan that even the boys who picked scrap for a living would not have given him that much for those heads, that the foundries were already complaining they could not find UB patterns clean enough to pull a fresh casting from, that whoever still ran a UB in this county was either rich or stubborn or both. Harlan listened. Harlan, 58 years old that fall, 6 feet tall, narrow through the shoulders, with the long hands of a man who had spent 40 years feeling for things in places he could not see, listened and did not answer. He took the bills back into the house long enough to put them in a tin on the kitchen shelf, and when he came out again, he was carrying a wheelbarrow and a folded square of burlap. Royce Tilton watched him load the 4 heads into the wheelbarrow one at a time. Royce kept talking. Royce said the only place those castings belonged was at the bottom of a culvert propping up a county road. Harlan nodded once because nodding cost nothing, and rolled the wheelbarrow toward the barn. The Minneapolis Moline UB was not a common tractor in 1983, and it had not been a common tractor in 1973. And by 1993, it would be the kind of machine you saw at a county fair under a tent with a hand-lettered sign explaining what it was. Built in Hopkins, Minnesota, between 1955 and 1958, the UB had carried a 283 cubic inch gasoline engine that owners loved for its torque and cursed for its tendency to crack a head if the coolant ever ran low on a hot August afternoon. 3 years of production, a short run, a small fleet. Every UB still turning over in 1983 was running on a head that had been cast in a window of time so narrow that by the early 80s, foundries trying to pour replacements were already running into the wall of vanished patterns and worn-out core boxes. Royce Tilton knew this in the way a dealer knows things. Harlan Bauer knew it in a different way. By the time Harlan reached the barn, the sun had climbed enough to throw a blade of light through the high east window of the loft, and the dust in the air swam in that light like something alive. He climbed the ladder one rung at a time, slower than he had at 50, slower than he would admit, and he carried each Minneapolis Moline UB head up that ladder by hand. 40 pounds of cracked iron in one arm, the other hand on the rung, the wood creaking under his boot. He made 4 trips. He did not ask his son for help. He did not ask the hired man. He carried each head himself because that was the way it had always been done, and because the carrying was part of the keeping. He stacked the 4 UB heads on the north wall of the loft, where the cold came hardest in winter and where the sun never reached in summer. Cast iron does not like temperature swings. Cast iron, especially cast iron that has already cracked once, will open its old wounds at the first hard freeze if you do not protect it. Harlan knew this. He laid out the burlap on the rough plank floor, and he wrapped each UB head in 2 thicknesses of it, folding the cloth around the deck and the ports and the cracked manifold face the way a midwife folds a blanket around a newborn. He tucked the corners. He set the heads down with the burlap between them and the plank, and he set them down with burlap between each casting and the next, so no iron touched iron, so no point of contact could become a point of frost. When he was finished, the 4 Minneapolis Moline UB heads sat on the north wall in a low, burlap-wrapped row, and from the doorway of the loft, they looked less like machine parts and more like something a man might leave at a shrine. Harlan stood for a moment in the doorway and counted. There were now 23 cylinder heads in the loft above the barn. 8 Oliver, 6 Farmall, 3 John Deere, 2 Alice Chalmers, and now 4 Minneapolis Moline. 23. He counted them twice, the way he counted calves at weaning, the way he counted bushels at harvest, and then he climbed back down the ladder. The neighbors had stopped counting by then. In the early years, when the loft had held 7 or 8 heads, the neighbors had counted out of curiosity, the way you count anything strange in the next man's barn. By the time the number passed 15, the counting had given way to a kind of half-amused shrug, the silent agreement among rural men that Harlan Bauer was doing something they did not understand and did not need to understand. Royce Tilton, on his drive home that October afternoon, told the story of the $40 sale at 3 different stops, and at every stop the men who heard it laughed, and at every stop somebody asked, with a tilt of the head, Just how many cracked heads did that old fool have up in his loft now anyway? And nobody could say. 20, 25, 30? The number had become a joke that nobody bothered to pin down the way you do not bother to count the crows on a fence line. Harlan did not tell anyone the number. He did not, that evening, write the number in the small ledger he kept in the kitchen drawer, the one bound in black cloth with the corners gone soft from 20 years of handling. He simply added the 4 UB heads to the column under the date, and he closed the ledger, and he ate his supper, and he sat by the window and watched the light go out of the field. The Minneapolis Moline UB heads sat in their burlap on the north wall of the loft, and the wind that came through the high east window after dark carried the first true cold of the season, and the iron lay still under its wrapping and waited. Royce Tilton would tell the story of the $40 sale for years. He would tell it at auctions and at coffee counters and at the implement dealer's annual open house, and the punchline would always be the same. That old man up by the river bought 4 dead heads for $40 and stacked them in his barn. The men who heard the story always laughed in the same place. None of them, in 1983, were asking the question that mattered. None of them were asking what a man like Harlan Bauer might know about cast iron, and about foundries, and about the difference between dead and broken, that the rest of them had not yet thought to learn. That question was still 6 years away, and the answer, when it came, would arrive on the back of a fire. The specialist arrived in the spring of 1984, on a morning when the ground was still soft from the last hard rain, and his name was Carl Henneman. Carl was 61 years old, built short and thick through the chest, with a white mustache that hung past the corners of his mouth and hands that were stained dark in the creases from 40 years of working with cast iron. He had driven up from Cedar Falls in a Chevrolet panel van with a hand-painted sign on the side that read Metalock Repair, Industrial Castings, and he had come because Harlan Bauer had written him a letter, on lined paper, in pencil, asking whether the process could be performed on agricultural cylinder heads of the kind common to the upper Midwest. Carl had not had a customer in 3 months. He had come. Harlan met Carl in the yard and shook his hand and led him, without preamble, to the barn. He climbed the ladder first. Carl Henneman, who was not a young man and who had not climbed many ladders that year, followed slowly, breathing through his mustache, and when his head came up through the square hole in the loft floor, he stopped on the 3rd rung from the top and did not say anything at all for a long moment. He was looking at the heads, 23 cylinder heads, in their stations along the 4 walls, wrapped in burlap and cloth, set out in the soft north light from the high east window, the dust drifting through the beams, the way it had drifted through that loft for 18 years. Carl Henneman had spent his working life in the company of broken iron. He had never seen broken iron arranged like this. Harlan asked him about the Metalock process. He asked plainly, the way a man asks a doctor about a procedure he is considering for himself. And Carl Henneman, recovering, climbed the rest of the way into the loft and walked slowly along the rows. He picked up an Oliver 88 head and turned it in his hands. He set it down. He picked up one of the Minneapolis Moline UB heads, the one with the long crack running clean across the deck, and he ran his thumb along the fracture line the way a man reads Braille. And then he began to talk. The Metalock process, Carl said, had been developed in England in the 1930s, refined through the war, and brought to American foundries in the 1950s by men who had served in the merchant marine and seen what could be done to a ship's engine 3,000 miles from the nearest dry dock. It was not welding. It was important, Carl said, that Harlan understand it was not welding. Welding cast iron was a problem because cast iron does not like heat. Cast iron, when you heat it past a certain point and then let it cool, will crack again right alongside the weld, will pull itself apart in a new place, because the metal on either side of the bead has been changed in ways that cannot be undone. Welding a cracked cylinder head was, more often than not, a temporary solution that became, within a season, a permanent ruin. Metallock did not use heat. Metallock was a cold repair, a mechanical stitch, a method of sewing iron back together with iron. Carl set the Minneapolis Moline UB head down on a workbench Harlan had cleared and pulled a small canvas roll from his coat pocket. He unrolled it. Inside were the tools of the trade: drill bits of specific diameters, taps, a series of small nickel-iron keys that looked like dog bone shapes, like the chess piece a child draws when they cannot remember what a knight looks like. Carl held one of the keys up to the light. This, he said, was a lock. Across the crack, he explained, you drilled a series of small holes at right angles to the fracture line, and into those holes you set the locks, and the locks held the two halves of the iron together the way the stitches in a wound hold the skin. Then, along the crack itself, you drilled overlapping holes and threaded in tapered plugs, plug by plug, each one slightly overlapping the last, until the entire fracture line had been replaced by a row of nickel iron plugs driven home and peened flat against the surrounding metal. When the work was done, properly done, you could run a fingernail across the deck and feel nothing. The crack would be gone. Not patched, replaced. Harlan listened. He stood with his arms folded across his canvas coat and his hands tucked into the opposite sleeves, and he listened the way he always listened, which was completely and without interruption. Carl Henneman talked for the better part of an hour. He explained which cracks could be stitched and which could not. A crack that ran through a valve seat was a problem. A crack that crossed a head bolt hole was a problem. A crack in the combustion chamber, if it ran into the water jacket, could be stitched if the geometry allowed, and could not be stitched if it did not. But a crack across the deck, even a long one, even one that looked at first glance like a death sentence, was very often a candidate. So was a crack along a manifold face. So was a corner broken away if you had the broken piece, and sometimes even if you did not. Not every crack is fatal. Carl Henneman said this sentence 3 times during that morning in the loft. And the third time he said it, Harlan Bauer nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when something he has known in his bones for many years has finally been spoken aloud by someone with the standing to say it. Not every crack is fatal. The dealers said otherwise. The dealers had been saying otherwise since 1965, when Harlan had hauled home the first Oliver 88 head and been laughed at for it. The dealer said a cracked head was a dead head, period. A cracked head was scrap. A cracked head was the end of the line, the place where a piece of agricultural machinery stopped being a tractor and started being landfill. Harlan had heard that pronouncement from Royce Tilton. He had heard it from a parts man at the John Deere dealership in Waverly. He had heard it from his own brother-in-law, who farmed 80 acres south of town, and who had once, in 1971, stood in this very loft and asked Harlan what in God's name he thought he was doing. A cracked head is a dead head, his brother-in-law had said. And Harlan, then 46, had not argued. He had only smiled, the small private smile of a man who has done his own reading, and changed the subject. Now, in the spring of 1984, Carl Henneman, the Metallock specialist, stood in the loft and confirmed, with the weight of 40 years and a canvas roll of nickel iron locks, what Harlan had quietly believed since the beginning. Cast iron could be stitched. Cast iron could be saved. Cast iron, properly held and properly worked, could be brought back from injuries that the dealers and the parts men and the brothers-in-law had pronounced fatal. And the difference between what could be saved and what could not depended not on the crack, but on the patience of the man examining it, and on whether anyone, anywhere, still cared to do the work. Carl Henneman, before he climbed back down the ladder, asked Harlan the question that any specialist asks before he commits to a job. He asked what Harlan intended to do with these heads. He gestured at the rows along the four walls, the burlap-wrapped Olivers and the Farmalls, and the Deers and the Alice Chalmers, and the four new Minneapolis Moline UBs, and he asked plainly whether Harlan was a dealer himself, or a restorer, or a collector, or what. Harlan considered the question for a long moment. Then he said only that he was keeping them. He said it the way a man says he is keeping a fence in repair, without explanation, without apology, because the keeping was the answer. Carl Henneman nodded. He understood, or he understood enough. He told Harlan he would come back when called. He told him his rates, and he wrote them on the back of a parts catalog, and he handed the catalog to Harlan. And then he climbed down out of the loft and drove south in the panel van. And the sound of his engine faded into the distance and was replaced by the sound of wind in the cottonwoods along the creek. The same week, by coincidence or not, Royce Tilton stopped by the farm to drop off a hydraulic hose Harlan had ordered. And the conversation drifted, as conversations between those two men always drifted, toward the loft. Royce, leaning against the fender of his truck with a toothpick rolling from one corner of his mouth to the other, repeated the line he had been repeating for almost 20 years. "A cracked head is a dead head," Royce said. Period. Full stop. End of story. He said it with the certainty of a man who had never once in his life examined the inside of a cylinder head with anything other than a wallet in mind. Harlan Bauer, standing in the gravel drive with the spring sun on his shoulders, did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not say a word about Carl Henneman or the metal lock process or the canvas roll of nickel iron locks. He simply lifted one long hand and pointed, with one finger, at the loft door above the barn. 27 castings now waited inside. 23 he had counted that fall, and 4 more he had brought home over the winter from a dispersal sale up near Decorah. And the loft had grown quietly past the threshold, where neighbors made jokes, and into the territory where neighbors stopped speaking of it altogether. 27 castings, each one declared dead by men like Royce Tilton, each one, in Harlan's quiet judgment, waiting. Royce Tilton looked at the loft door. He looked back at Harlan. He shook his head, the way he always shook his head, and he climbed into his truck and drove away. And the dust from his tires hung in the air for a long time after the truck was gone. Harlan Bauer stood in the drive and watched it settle, and then he went back to work, and the loft stood above the barn in the spring sun, and the question of who was right and who was wrong was still 5 years from being answered. But the foundry on the edge of town was already there. The foundry had been there for 60 years, and in the foundry's pattern room, on shelves that ran from floor to ceiling, the wooden masters for every cracked head in Harlan Bauer's loft were waiting too. The foundry sat on the southwest corner of town, on a 3-acre lot bounded by the railroad on one side and a drainage ditch on the other. And it had been there since 1929. Hessel Iron Works. The sign over the office door had been painted in 1948 and never repainted since, and the letters had faded to the color of weak tea. But everyone in the county still knew what the building was and what it did. For 60 years, Hessel Iron Works had poured castings for the agricultural trade, plowshares and cultivator shanks and gear housings and manifold blanks and, most importantly for our story, cylinder heads, replacement heads, repair castings, the slow, quiet work of keeping the equipment of a 4-county farming region alive, one pour at a time. The foundry was owned in 1989 by a man named August Hessel, 67 years old, the grandson of the original founder and the third Hessel to run the place. August was a short, round man with rimless eyeglasses and a habit of wiping his hands on a red shop rag he kept tucked permanently into his back pocket. He had inherited the foundry from his father in 1971 and had inherited, with it, the pattern library that was the true wealth of the operation. though no banker in the county would have called it that. The patterns were not on the books as assets. The patterns were not insured. The patterns were, in the strict accounting sense, worth nothing at all. In the strict practical sense, the patterns were worth more than the building. A foundry pattern, for those who have never set foot in a casting shop, is the wooden master from which a sand mold is made. To pour a cylinder head, you do not pour into a steel die the way you would for a precision aluminum part. You pour into a sand mold, and the sand mold is shaped by pressing fine green sand around a wooden pattern that is the exact form of the finished casting, with allowances for shrinkage and for machining stock. The pattern is made by a pattern maker, a craft trade now nearly extinct, working from blueprints or, in many older cases, from a sample casting and a set of calipers and 40 years of judgment. A good pattern, properly made and properly stored, will pour castings for decades. A great pattern can pour for a century. The patterns at Hessel Ironworks ranged in age from 6 months to 58 years, and they covered, in their accumulated shelves, the production history of nearly every American agricultural manufacturer that had ever sold a tractor in the upper Midwest. Harlan Bauer visited the foundry in the late summer of 1989. He was 64 years old that summer, his hair gone the color of wood ash, his shoulders narrower than they had been when he carried the first Oliver 88 head up the Loft ladder 24 years earlier. He drove into town on a Wednesday morning, parked the pickup beside the office, and asked August Hessel if he might see the pattern room. August, who had known Harlan Bauer since the two of them were boys in the same country school, said of course, and led the way through the office and through the foundry floor, and down a short corridor into the long, low building at the back of the lot where the patterns were kept. The pattern room was a cathedral. That is the only honest word for it. The ceiling rose to 20 feet, and the walls were lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, and the shelves were filled, every one, with wooden patterns of every shape and size that 60 years of agricultural casting had required. Patterns the size of a man's fist, patterns the size of a kitchen table, patterns hung from hooks, patterns nested in wooden crates, patterns labeled in pencil on small paper tags wired to one corner. The light came from high clerestory windows along the south wall, and it fell across the shelves in long bars, and the air smelled of old shellac and pine, and the faint, sweet rot of wood that has been handled by oily hands for a very long time. August Hessel led Harlan to the section of the room reserved for cylinder heads. There were 3 full bays. The patterns for the Oliver heads sat on the second shelf from the bottom of the first bay, lined up by model and year, the 70, and the 77 and the 88 and the Super 88 and the 880 and the 1800. The Farmall patterns occupied most of the second bay, an enormous accumulation that ran from the F12 up through the M and the Super M and the 400 and the 450 and the 560. The John Deere patterns shared the third bay with the Alice Chalmers and the Minneapolis Moline, including, on the top shelf, a row of 4 UB head patterns that August Hessel told Harlan were the only complete set he was aware of, within 500 miles. The patterns for the UB had been made in 1956 by a pattern maker named Otto Reinhardt, who had died in 1973. And Otto's tools had been buried with it, and the patterns themselves were now, August said, irreplaceable. Irreplaceable. August Hessel used that word in the pattern room in the late summer of 1989, and Harlan Bauer turned the word over in his mind the way a man turns a coin he has just pulled from a creek bed. Irreplaceable. The pattern makers were dying. The blueprints, in many cases, had been lost decades ago in the bankruptcies and consolidations and warehouse fires and corporate dispersals that had swept American agricultural manufacturing through the 70s and 80s. To make a new pattern from scratch today, August said, you would need a sample casting in pristine condition, and you would need a pattern maker. And there were perhaps 4 men in the upper Midwest who still had the skill, and the youngest of them was 68 years old. Harlan asked the question that had brought him to the foundry. He asked August Hessel whether the patterns had been backed up, whether copies had been made, whether duplicates existed somewhere in another building, in another city, in another state, whether anything at all had been done to ensure that this room, with its 60 years of accumulated wooden masters, could be reconstituted in the event that something happened to it. August Hessel laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the small, embarrassed laugh of a man who has been asked a question he has asked himself many times and never satisfactorily answered. There were no copies. There were no duplicates. There was no off-site storage. The patterns existed in this room, on these shelves, in these bays, and nowhere else on Earth. Insurance, August said, was prohibitive, and the company's books did not carry the patterns as assets in any case, and a duplicate pattern library, even if you could commission one, would cost more than the foundry was worth. The patterns were what they were. They sat on the shelves. They poured the castings. They had done so for 60 years. They would, August trusted, do so for another 60. Harlan Bauer walked the bays slowly. He stopped at each shelf. He read the pencil labels on the tags. He stood for a long time in front of the row of 4 Minneapolis Moline UB head patterns on the top shelf of the third bay. The ones Otto Reinhardt had made in 1956, the ones whose shapes corresponded almost exactly to the 4 cracked UB heads stacked in burlap on the north wall of the Loft 8 miles north of town. He did not reach up to touch them. He simply looked. His face, August Hessel would later tell his wife at supper, was the face of a man counting something that did not have a number. Harlan said nothing about the Loft. He said nothing about the cylinder heads. He said nothing about the metal-lock process, or about Carl Henneman, or about Royce Tilton's 20-year-old joke. He thanked August Hessel for the tour, and he shook the foundry man's hand at the office door, and he climbed into the pickup and drove the 8 miles home with the windows down and the early September wind moving through the cab. That evening, Harlan Bauer climbed the loft ladder 1 rung at a time, slower than he had at 58, slower than he had at 60, and he stood in the doorway of the loft and counted the cylinder heads along the 4 walls. There were 31 now, 31 castings wrapped in burlap, set out in their stations, waiting. He had visited the foundry once. He had studied the shelves. He had said nothing. And the patterns and the castings, on that September evening in 1989, sat 8 miles apart in the long dusk of an Iowa summer, 2 halves of a single answer. And the question that joined them had not yet been asked. The answer would come on a Monday night in October. It would come fast and hot, and it would come without warning. And by Tuesday morning, the question would be the only thing left. The fire started a little after 11 o'clock on the night of October 16, 1989, in the curing room at the back of the foundry. The curing room was where freshly poured castings were set to cool slowly under heat lamps, a process meant to relieve the internal stresses that cause cast iron to crack as it returns to room temperature. The lamps ran on a bank of old industrial circuits, and the wiring in that bank had been installed in 1962, and the fire marshal would conclude 3 weeks later that a junction box in the southwest corner had failed in a manner consistent with insulation breakdown of long standing. None of that mattered in the early hours of October 17th to August Hessel or to the men of the volunteer fire department or to anyone else in the 4-county area whose livelihood was in some small way anchored to the building on the southwest corner of town. What mattered was that the fire moved fast. The curing room was separated from the pattern storage building by a short covered walkway, and the walkway was sheathed in tongue and groove pine that had been varnished and revarnished and revarnished again over the course of 40 years. The walkway burned in under 3 minutes. By 11:30, the patterned storage building, the long, low cathedral with the clerestory windows and the wooden shelves and the 60 years of agricultural masters, was fully involved. The volunteer department arrived at 11:41. They could do nothing but protect the buildings on the adjacent lots. The patterned storage building burned through the night. The roof collapsed at 1:15 in the morning. By dawn, what had been a cathedral of wooden masters was a black rectangle on the ground, knee-deep in ash, with the iron skeleton of the shelving unit standing crooked and warped through the haze like the ribs of a beached ship. August Hessel arrived at the foundry at 12:06. He was wearing pajama pants and an overcoat and a pair of work boots he had not bothered to lace, and he stood in the gravel parking lot beside the office for the next 6 hours and did not move and did not speak. The fire chief, a man named Donnie Ostergaard, tried twice to get August to go home, to come down to the firehouse, to sit in a warm room with a cup of coffee, and August Hessel only shook his head and stayed where he was. He was watching the pattern room burn. He was watching the wooden masters that his grandfather and his father and he himself had accumulated over 3 generations turn into smoke and rise into the October night and disappear over the railroad tracks toward the east. The patterns were not insured. August Hessel had told Harlan Bauer this plainly 6 weeks earlier in the pattern room itself. The foundry building was insured. The tooling on the foundry floor was insured at a depreciated value that would not begin to cover its replacement. The patterns were not on the policy at all, because no underwriter in the state of Iowa had been willing to carry them at a premium August Hessel could afford, and because August Hessel, like his father and his grandfather, had operated for 60 years on the unspoken assumption that a foundry does not burn. Foundries are buildings full of sand and iron and water. Foundries do not burn until they do. By morning, the building was gone. The patterns were ash. The tooling that had not been moved out of the curing room was a heap of fused metal, the precise shapes lost forever. The steel flow rings and core boxes and sand flasks reduced to lumps that no machinist would ever find a use for. August Hessel walked the ruin in the gray light of the 17th. His red shop rag still tucked into the back pocket of his pajama pants, and he stopped at the place where the cylinder head bay had been. And he stood for a long time among the ash, and what he was looking for could no longer be found. The phone calls began before noon. They began in the small, dense network of men who depended on Hessel Ironworks for the slow, obscure work of agricultural restoration, and they spread outward through the day in widening rings. A restorer in Mason City who had a Farmall M waiting on ahead. A mechanic in Charles City with 2 Oliver 88s torn down on his shop floor and a customer expecting them by Thanksgiving. A collector in Owatonna who had been waiting 11 months for a John Deere Model A pour. A parts man in Cedar Rapids who handled Alice Chalmers and who had just placed an order the previous Friday for 3 WD-40 spine for 5 blanks. By Tuesday evening, the news had reached Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois and South Dakota. And by Wednesday morning, the volume on the long-distance lines into the foundry office was such that August Hessel's secretary, a woman named Marlies Kuipers, who had worked there since 1968, had to stop answering and let the calls go to the answering machine, and the answering machine fill up and the calls go unanswered entirely. The men on the other ends of those lines were not panicking about the foundry, they were panicking about themselves. Each of them had a customer, or several customers, or a shop full of half-disassembled tractors, and each of them had been operating on the same unspoken assumption that August Hessel had operated on, which was that Hessel Ironworks would always be there, that when a head cracked, you sent it to Hessel, and Hessel poured a replacement, and the tractor lived another 20 years. That assumption had held for 60 years. That assumption had been ash by sunrise on the 17th. The men began to ask one another whether anyone had a stockpile. whether anyone in the four-state region had pulled extra blanks before the fire, whether any other foundry in Iowa or in Minnesota or in Illinois still held patterns for the older heads, the Olivers and the Farmalls and the Deers and the Alices and the Minneapolis Molines that no major manufacturer had supported in 20 years. The answers came back slowly in negatives. Other foundries had patterns for some lines. No other foundry had patterns for all lines. And nobody, anywhere, had a complete set of UB heads. The four wooden masters Otto Reinhardt had cut in 1956 had been the only set within 500 miles, and they had burned on Monday night. Harlan Bauer heard the news on Tuesday. He was in the kitchen of the white farmhouse fixing a cup of coffee at the propane stove, and the radio on the windowsill, tuned permanently to the AM station out of Waterloo, broke into the noon farm report with a bulletin about a foundry fire in the southwest part of the county. Harlan stood at the stove with the coffee pot in his hand and listened to the bulletin all the way through. He did not set the pot down. He did not sit down. When the bulletin ended and the farm report resumed with the noon corn prices, Harlan poured his cup and he drank it slowly at the kitchen table, and his face did not change. He said very little that day. His son, calling that evening from Cedar Falls to ask whether Dad had heard about the foundry, found him uncharacteristically quiet on the phone. His son asked twice if everything was all right. Harlan said only that he had heard, and that it was a shame about the patterns, and that August Hessel was a good man and would find his way through. He did not mention the loft. He did not mention the 31-cylinder head stacked in burlap along the four walls of the loft above the barn. He did not, in fact, climb the loft ladder at all on the 17th, or on the 18th, or on the 19th. He went about his October work, the corn standing brown and dry in the fields, the equipment being readied for harvest, the small 1,000 chores of a farm in the third week of autumn, and he said almost nothing about the fire. What he was thinking, in those days, no one would ever fully know. Harlan Bauer was not a man who explained himself, but the loft above the barn now held the only pristine examples, in many cases the only existing examples, of cast iron cylinder heads that had been declared dead for a quarter century by every dealer and every parts man in the upper Midwest. The patterns that could have made replacements were ash. The castings in the loft, broken though they were the last of their kind. And the men on the long-distance lines, the restorers and the mechanics and the collectors, had not yet thought to look for them. But they would. By the end of October, they would. The loft door above the barn was closed against the autumn wind, and inside, in the dim north light, the 31-cylinder heads lay in their burlap and waited. They had been waiting, in some cases, for 24 years. They had been waiting for a question that was, finally, on its way to find them. The first restorer arrived on the last Saturday of October. He drove a brown Ford pickup with Wisconsin plates, and his name was Donovan Prees. And he had driven 6.5 hours from a town outside of Eau Claire because a friend of a friend had told him, on the telephone, that there was an old man up by the Cedar River who was rumored to have a barn full of cylinder heads. Donovan Prees did not know whether the rumor was true. He did not know whether, if true, the old man would sell. He did not know whether the heads, if they existed, would be in any condition to use. He drove anyway because he had a 1948 Farmall M in his shop with a cracked head and a customer who was paying him to restore it, and because Hessel Iron Works was ash, and because there was nowhere else left to look. He pulled into Harlan Bauer's gravel drive at 4:15 in the afternoon. Harlan, 64 years old, in his canvas chore coat with the torn pocket, came out of the machine shed with a wrench in his hand and stood in the yard and waited for Donovan Prees to introduce himself. Donovan did. He explained the situation. He explained the Farmall M and the customer, and the fire at Hessel, and the rumor he had been chasing for a week. Harlan listened the way he always listened, completely and without interruption. And when Donovan had finished, Harlan set the wrench down on the bumper of the pickup and asked Donovan whether he wanted to see the loft. Donovan Price climbed the loft ladder behind Harlan Bauer at 4:30 in the afternoon on the last Saturday of October 1989. And when his head came up through the square hole in the floor, Donovan did exactly what Carl Henneman had done 5 years earlier, which was to stop on the third rung from the top and not say anything for a long moment. He was looking at the heads. He was looking at 31 cylinder heads wrapped in burlap, set out in their stations along the four walls of the loft, the dust drifting through the late October light, and Donovan Price, who had been in the restoration trade for 11 years and who had thought he had seen every iteration of this business that the upper Midwest could produce, understood in that moment that he had not. Word spread from Donovan Price the way a fire spreads through tongue and groove pine. By the first week of November, 2 more restorers had driven up. By the second week, 4 more. By Thanksgiving, men were calling Harlan's house at all hours. And a few were arriving without calling at all, parking in the gravel drive and waiting for him to come out of whichever building he was working in that day. They came from Iowa and from Minnesota and from Wisconsin, and one came from Indiana, and one drove 14 hours from a small town in eastern South Dakota with a single Alice Chalmers WD-45 block in the bed of his truck and a hope that did not quite dare to call itself a hope. Harlan Bauer, in those weeks, did something he had not done in 24 years. He took the small black cloth ledger out of the kitchen drawer and he began to catalog. He climbed the loft ladder with the ledger and a stub of pencil, and he went head by head along the 4 walls, and he wrote down what was there. 8 Oliver, 6 Farmall, 3 John Deere, now 4 with the pair, plus 2 more brought home from the Decorah dispersal, 2 Alice Chalmers, now 3, 4 Minneapolis Moline UB, and 12 more accumulated quietly through the 80s from auctions and dispersals and roadside encounters that brought the total on the page in the ledger to 31 castings exactly, 31 heads. He wrote the number at the bottom of the page, and he underlined it once, and he closed the ledger. The catalog ran across both sides of 2 pages, and it noted, beside each casting, the model and the year, and the nature of the crack, and the condition of the surrounding metal. Harlan was not a written-down man by nature, but the moment had become one in which the writing had begun to matter. The men who came to the loft, increasingly, were men who needed to know. They needed to know whether the third Oliver 88 head from the south wall was a 1952 or a 1954 casting. They needed to know whether the corner-broken Farmall M had its broken corner intact and stored beside it. They needed to know whether the welded Minneapolis Moline UB on the north wall was the one with the manifold face hairline or the one with the long deck crack, because the difference between those 2 cracks in the new economy that had emerged from the ash of Hessel Iron Works was the difference between a casting that could be metallock stitched into a working head and a casting that could be used as a master to cut a new wooden pattern from. Each casting in the loft was now worth more than the tractor it had come from. Harlan understood this without anyone needing to explain it to him. A 1952 Oliver 88, complete and running, in average condition, would sell at a Saturday auction in 1989 for somewhere between $1,800 and $2,400. The cracked head from a 1952 Oliver 88 in the New World was worth whatever the market would bear. And the market, in the late autumn of 1989, was beginning to bear numbers that no one in the 4-county area would have believed possible 6 weeks earlier. Donovan Price, on his second visit, offered Harlan $1,100 for a single Farmall M head. that Harlan had paid $15 for in 1968. Harlan thanked him and considered, and asked Donovan to come back in the spring. He was not in a hurry. That was the thing that the men who drove up his gravel drive came to understand. Slowly, sometimes painfully. Harlan Bauer, in the autumn of his 64th year, was not a man who was going to be hurried. He had waited 24 years to be asked the question that the Loft had been quietly preparing to answer. And he was not going to give the answer in 3 weeks because someone from Wisconsin needed a head by Thanksgiving. The castings would be made available, in their time, in their order, to the restorers and the mechanics and the collectors who could best use them. Harlan, in his slow and unhurried way, was beginning the work of figuring out who those men were. Royce Tilton called on the 8th of November. Royce was 60 years old that fall, still lean as a fence post, still wearing the feed store cap pushed back on his head, still telling the same jokes at the same coffee counters. He had heard, at one of those coffee counters, that there were now 3 pickups a week in Harlan Bauer's gravel drive, and that one of them had Indiana plates, and that the old man up by the river was being asked for prices that would have stopped a banker's heart. Royce, who in 1983 had laughed when he sold Harlan 4 Minneapolis Moline UB heads for $40, picked up the phone in his office at the dealership and called the white farmhouse on the Cedar River. The phone rang 9 times. Harlan was in the loft. He heard the phone through the open kitchen window, and he heard it stop. And he heard the answering machine his son had given him for Christmas the previous year click on and click off. He did not climb down. He did not return the call that day. He did not return it the day after. He stood in the loft above the barn, in the long, cold light of an Iowa November, and he counted the cylinder heads along the 4 walls one more time. And he wrote a small note in the back of the ledger that no one but he would ever read. And the wind moved through the high east window and lifted a corner of the burlap on the north wall, where the 4 Minneapolis Moline UB heads had been waiting, in their patient, cracked silence, for 6 years. Royce Tilton would call again. So would others. The Loft, which had been a joke for 24 years, had become, in the space of a single fire, the most consequential agricultural building between the Mississippi and the Missouri. And the man who climbed its ladder in canvas and ash-gray hair was no longer a fool. The dealers laughed at. He was something else now. Something the country roads of 3 states were beginning, awkwardly and belatedly, to understand. And what the Loft itself knew, what it had always known, was the thing that Harlan Bauer had spent a quarter of a century quietly waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to. Picture it one last time. The loft above the barn, dust hanging gold in the slatted morning light, and the iron stacked the way Harlan Bauer stacked it 18 years ago. The Oliver 88 head, the Farmall M castings, the John Deere pair, the Alice WD 45 block, the Minneapolis Moline heads from the Kepler place, cracked, every one of them. Broken, every one of them. Worthless, the world had said. For almost 2 decades, the world was wrong. Broken is not the same as worthless, and the Loft had been quietly proving that point since 1996. Industrial supply chains forget what farmers never do, that a casting outlasts the foundry that poured it, that patience is its own kind of inventory, and that a man with a flatbed trailer and a clean loft floor is sometimes worth more than a corporation with a catalog. Harlan stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, 18 years of keeping behind him, and one morning of vindication ahead. The dust settled on the iron. The iron, as it always had, waited. If you want more stories of quiet rural foresight, the patient farmers, the saved iron, the small decisions that outlast empires, subscribe to the channel. A new story lands every week, pulled from barns, lofts, and back roads most people drive right past.